Big story, and it's a major one. The Jim Comey memos. Now, we now know what's in those memos, and now the Justice Department watchdog also knows what's in those memos, and now he wants to investigate whether two of them have leaked classified information on the inside of them when he gave some of those memos to his good buddy at Columbia just uptown here, who was at the Justice Department. Fox News Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge is trying to stay up with this, but man, this book tour is getting quite interesting, isn't it, Catherine?
It is, Brian, and thank you. Fox News confirms that Comey is under investigation by the Justice Department's internal watchdog, the Inspector General, for leaking the memos, whether he mishandled classified information, as well as his communications outside the FBI, including reporters. The memos show the relationship between the president and Comey was difficult from the very beginning, after Comey briefed Mr. Trump about the dossier's unverified claims just 3 weeks before the inauguration. Those who support the president say the memos show he wanted the Russia claims investigated. With Comey writing, the president said it would be good to find out, but that he hadn't done anything and hoped I would find a way to get out that we weren't investigating him. President's critics say another memo shows he crossed the line when he talked with Comey about a loyalty pledge. Comey wrote, I replied that he would always get honesty from me. Trump paused and said, that's what he wants, honest loyalty. I replied, you will get that from me. Of the 15 pages of memos, 8 contained classified information at the secret, which is highly sensitive, or confidential level. And that seems to be at odds with Comey's congressional testimony after he was fired.
My thinking was, if I write it in such a way that I don't include anything that would trigger a classification, that'll make it easier for us to discuss within the FBI and the government, and to hold on to it in a way that makes it accessible to us.
But in this very first memo in January of 2017, Comey knew his conversations with the president were sensitive and not public information. I am not sure of the proper classification here, he wrote, so have chosen secret. Please let me know if it should be higher or lower than that. So tonight we have a serious investigation by the Inspector General at the Justice Department and another apparent conflict between the documents and Comey's testimony, Brian.
And it's, you know, you can't say this is political or President Trump's DOJ. It's an Inspector General appointed by President Obama,
correct?
That's
correct. That's correct.
Catherine, great job. You make it sound so simple, but yet we know it's really complicated.
I appreciate
Thank you.
that. Okay.
Meanwhile, straight ahead, have a great weekend, Catherine. Comey spoke about leaking the memos during the interview with George Stephanopoulos earlier this week. You know, the interview that never ended? Take a look.
The president's tweeted innumerable times calling you a leaker. Well, what's your response to President Trump?
Look, it's true. I mean, I'm the one who testified about it. That's how people know about it. I gave that unclassified memo to my friend and asked him to give it to a reporter. That is entirely appropriate.
Really? In what world? The Wall Street Journal's editorial board member, Kim Strassel, one of her latest columns is she talked about the questions that she wants James Comey to answer. First off, is it right for him to have leaked that memo? And his reasoning is bizarre. He says, I needed to get the information into the public square. What is this, 1778?
Yeah, hi, Brian. And no, of course it's not appropriate. This is a man who has nailed to the wall numerous people from his perch at the FBI for having mishandled classified information, for leaking. He talks in his memos about how he tells President Trump he wants to go after the leakers, make an example of them. And just because Jim Comey decided that he was entitled to take these documents, which arguably, by the way, are FBI property, they were in his possession, and then decide that he alone is entitled for the public interest to leak. Everyone who leaks has some sort of motivation like this, and it doesn't justify what he did.
He had 4 memos out. 2 of them they're taking another look at. Meanwhile, his deputy, Andy McCabe, clearly is in trouble. He told multiple lies, so he's going to be skewered. We're going to find out if the criminal referral will result in charges. But looking at Comey in particular, I have a little problem. For example, his pull-aside in the Oval Office. That is very similar to the pull-aside in Trump Tower. If you have a new person into politics who's used to running a major organization and wants to have a confidential conversation, if you know more about how it's done, how about this, Jim Comey? Instead of jotting it down after you leave, hey, Mr. President, no offense, I'm sure you don't realize I shouldn't really be one-on-one with you. Let's get somebody else in the room for your own, just so you don't have a problem later. There are so many ways to avoid the problem. Instead, we hear about the voice in his head, and he writes in longhand, and we eventually get a best-selling book.
There does seem to be almost a sense of entrapment in these memos, as though he was urging the president to do things so that he could then run back outside and write down the bad things the president had done in his mind. And by the way, the double standard here too, Brian, I think is glaringly evident. Jim Comey tells us in his book and on this tour about the doubts he had about Loretta Lynch and her judgment, some of the orders she gave him. But do we have any conversations between him and her that were memorialized? Absolutely not. So, I mean, and there's a lot of other things that come out of this memo too. I think we're finding as well that Jim Comey, he likes to talk about how he's just a facts guy, but again, only the facts that matter. And once we're seeing the context of a lot of these statements that have been wafting around in the press for the last year, it turns out there's a very different reading of this than the one that only Jim Comey was giving us up until now.
It's unbelievable. I just think that if he had any brains in his head, one interview and get off the stage. The more he talks, the more news unfolds, the more he backs himself into a corner. And now his battles with Andy McCabe, because they both can't be telling the truth because both their stories diverge. Kimberly, I look forward to your next article. I'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
All right. Meanwhile, the memo news sparked a Twitter response from the president for a change. I didn't even know he had a Twitter account. James Comey memos just out and show clearly there was no collusion and no obstruction. Also, he leaked classified information. Wow. Will the witch hunt continue? Jonathan Turley's a lawyer. He knows the answer to that, and a professor of constitutional law at George Washington University, which is over $70,000 a year. I looked at that, and they don't offer much aid.
It's a deal.
Okay, it is a deal, but you're there, so it makes it worth it. So what do we learn now, Jonathan, that we didn't know before this book published that has you really intrigued?
Well, it confirms many things that some of us have been saying. You know, for over a year, he's had many supporters who have been saying things that I think are facially simply unsupportable. One of them is that these were some type of personal diary, that they were his personal notes. He continues to maintain that, and that's facially ridiculous. I mean, if you look at these memos, they're not to him. They're not memos to the file. They're memos to other FBI officials. And he's actually stating in one of the memos how he wants to do the preliminary classification and giving it to these other officials for their input. These are not personal records. But also the FBI itself has said this is FBI material. So you have someone who was fired as the director of the FBI removing 7 documents from the FBI, 4 of which were deemed to have classified information, and then giving them to a friend for the purpose of leaking them to the media. That's a very serious set of facts, and it doesn't exactly speak to the ethical leadership model that Comey has been a proponent of.
So when President Trump sits there as the businessman turned brand new politician and says, what's going on with Comey? He's a leaker. What's going on with McCabe? He's a liar. What's going on? I think there's a bias at the FBI. Piers Strzok, Lisa Page. Yes, 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 and yes. His instincts were right on this.
Well, I think that when it comes to Comey, many of his criticisms have been borne out, as with McCabe. Now, it doesn't mean that the president hasn't made his own mistakes, but he's been blessed by the critics that he has inherited. And I think that with regard to McCabe, it's a very strong argument for a charge. It's the very case that he and others brought against Flynn. He was part of that investigation initially. His situation seems more serious. But with regard to Comey, you know, there's other problems with this. One is, why would he give this to his friend? What we now know is that various FBI officials had the document. So this wasn't going to be destroyed. He knew it was going to go to investigators. It was already in the hands of investigators. But instead, in giving it to Congress or leaving it with the investigators, he chose to give it to a friend to leak to the media. Why? It wasn't going to help the investigation. It was going to hurt it because he just told Trump these documents exist. What is the answer, it seems, is that it was to his advantage, and that's why he did it.
And because the president acted angrily in their one-on-one sessions and asked for certain things, he assumes that means he's guilty, or Democrats assume that thinks he's guilty. Actually, that might be a human reaction. They accuse you of cavorting with prostitutes. That could become international news. And by the way, the worst news is your wife could find out. And he expressed that in the one-on-one meetings, and that emerged. Also, he said, pursue any satellite problems or anybody that worked with me. And he writes, I assume that meant people that worked for him that may have colluded with Russia. Follow that path. That really didn't get out until these memos were public.
Well, I think that much of this is now going to be public, and we're going to, for the first time, see a complete record. But one of the more interesting aspects about Comey's conduct with regards to these memos and his book is that he seems to have put the investigation into a secondary position. Running a tell-all book while the investigation is ongoing and you're a principal witness is not helping the investigation any more than leaking those memos were. They helped Jim Comey.
Jonathan Turley, we have to tax you almost every day into your legal knowledge in order to keep up with an investigation that is like no other. Thanks so much, sir.
Thank you, Brian.
All right, before Comey was under investigation for leaking classified information, he was criticizing Hillary Clinton for doing the same thing.
Although we did not find clear evidence that Secretary Clinton or her colleagues intended to violate laws governing the handling of classified information, there is evidence that they were extremely careless in their handling of very sensitive, highly classified information.
So how ironic is this? Robin Byro is a Democratic strategist, was with the Clinton campaign for a while. Robin, what do you think about these new revelations about how the Inspector General has a problem with some of the classification and the use of James Comey's memos?
You know, it's really hard to wrap my brain around this. Just honestly, Comey's fall from grace has been stellar because this is somebody who was widely regarded on both sides of the aisle until the 2016 elections. And now, you know, as a veteran Army Ranger who served with Ranger Regiment, I was awarded a top secret security clearance. I know very well everything that goes into that and the responsibilities that that carries. He seems to me too smart of a man to make a mistake like this. But then again, so did Hillary Clinton. Well, not a man, excuse me. But, you know, I just can't understand how people like this get into these situations when they know full well the responsibilities that having that level of clearance carries with it. So, you know, honestly, I have trouble even processing this. It's hard to believe, honestly, and I have to wonder if he's just trying to sell books or if this is made up, if this is part of this crazy deep state conspiracy theory stuff that I constantly hear thrown around that no one can really explain to me. We don't use that term on the Democratic side, but, you know, it's just all a lot to try and wrap my brain around, Brian.
You know, he never really had a relationship with Hillary Clinton. He talked about trying to meet her once and never didn't go so well, and maybe he had a negative feeling about something he did in his background. But in the end, what he has to be transparent about is his relationship with Loretta Lynch. To be honest, it would alleviate a lot of the mystery into why he acted the way he acted. Just come out and say, I couldn't trust that Justice Department. That's why I did it. I was up to Hillary Clinton deserves the criticism for having Uma Abedin put that emails on her laptop. That forced me to act. And then it's game on. Then we can debate it. But I can't get to the point where we debate it because he talks circuitously about his thinking where he contradicts himself in the same answer.
Yes, and that's the problem. And Americans just want to know the truth. We want to know what happened here, and we're not getting straight answers. People are getting mad. You know, I know the DNC just sued, and really, it's so hard just right now. There's so much conflicting information going on. Honestly, I wish this investigation would just wrap up so that we would find out what's going on and just get to the truth of the matter and put politics aside. We're all Americans. None of this just seems to be panning out to me and making sense, and especially Comey right now. I just can't understand. You know, he even said that he wouldn't have brought the charges against Clinton the week before the election because he thought she was going to win. So as a Democrat, that blew my mind because
it makes no sense. And then he said politics didn't enter, but politics entered. Got to go.
Clearly.
Robin, I mean, you're wrestling with it outwardly with us, helping the show get better, but the same way I do, too. I can't make sense of it. The one thing is pretty clear. The left and the right agree he's not making much sense. I don't really know where his constituency is, but he has sold almost 1 million books. Robin Byro, thanks so much.
Thank you, sir.